If you were a young kid like me, growing up in the late 90s and early 2000s, Spyro the Dragon was probably one of your favorite games. I first played it in 2000 at the age of 6, and it played a large role in forming a love of gaming that is still going strong today. Its simple design, pleasant movement, mesmerizing colors, surreal worlds, easy-to-grasp mechanics, and cool characters made for alluring staples that kept my young mind occupied. Looking back, it was a game that anyone could enjoy, even young children first learning to use a controller. The simple platforming and mechanics made the game approachable for youngsters, but complexities in level design allowed teenagers and adults to share in the joy. And its enjoyment that has endured over the years. Here I am 24 years later at the age of 30 with a deep desire to revisit the original trilogy, looking at it with a much more analytical pair of eyes and discussing my overall thoughts on why the series' interest, love, and passion hasn't withered since 1998. What was it about this original title that spawned an iconic mascot? One that would go on to be featured in many sequels, some similar, some different, some beloved, and some dreaded. Well, join me and find out as I take a deep dive into Spyro the Dragon, examining the gameplay, the characters, the level design, the art style, and much, much more. But first, the elephant in the room. Yes, this footage is from the Spyro Reignited trilogy, not the original games. Trust me, I would love to play the originals and use footage from that, but I simply don't have any legal way to play and record that game. However, I'm trying to look at things in a positive light. Much of the original experience is intact here in Reignited, meaning much of the brilliant work that Insomniac did back in the 90s is preserved here. At the same time, I can highlight some of the elements that Toys for Bob either did well with or struggled to maintain as they crafted this overall pretty good remaster. I'm hoping to get the best of both worlds, and it should give me more to talk about in this video because, let's face facts, the first Spyro is pretty simple, but yeah, that's what we're going to deal with here. I hope you can get down with that, so let's get into it. Released on September 9th, 1998, Spyro the Dragon represented a fresh start for developer Insomniac, who had just finished working on Disruptor, a Doom clone that allowed the relatively inexperienced team to get their footing in the industry. That title was well received, but sold poorly, and in an industry continuously looking to tap into as big a player base as possible, violence turned away too many young players. So, the team got started on a new, more family-friendly project. A desire to appeal to younger children and adults wasn't the only changing trend in gaming though, as 3D polygonal graphics were becoming all the rage, and mascot characters, yeah, you still needed one of those. If the team could find a way to capture all three of these elements into a single experience, they may just strike gold, and it's safe to say they succeeded. The stars seemed to align for the team at Insomniac. They had arrived on a great new concept for a game that would feature a dragon as its mascot, on the basis that dragons were really freaking cool. They got to work designing Spyro, who was originally known as Pete. Yeah, Pete. After some iterations on the name and character model, the team arrived on Spyro, a purple and yellow dragon who would traverse large open levels, collecting objects, and overcoming platforming challenges in 3D. A brilliant new mascot featured in a family-friendly genre. A strong start, but more work was needed to stand out in the ever-growing crowd. The team was able to land a break when choosing to take advantage of new technology. A 3D panoramic engine that allowed for greater draw distances was created by Alex Hastings, and this allowed the team to create expansive levels for the time without sacrificing on the graphics. This, along with bringing in NASA experts to help develop Spyro's fun movement mechanics, particularly the flying controls, was a recipe for success and allowed the team to finish up their project for release in 1998. Despite the slow start to sales, Insomniac's work paid off as the game would go on to sell over 5 million copies and was received very well by critics and fans. The enduring love for the franchise would result in an eventual remake of the original trilogy. Released in 2018, developer Toys for Bob created a mostly faithful recreation of Insomniac's legendary trilogy, and that too sold quite well, proving that there's still a market fiending for an old-fashioned Spyro game. I myself played the remake back in 2018 and loved it, going so far as to feature it in my top 10 games list of that year, which is a video that you definitely should not watch because it's old and every YouTuber cringes at their earliest videos, and this is no exception. But this is how we're going to be looking at the game today through the lens of the Reignited trilogy, so let's jump in. Removed in the Reignited trilogy, the original game opened with a shot of a Gnorc climbing a mountain. He planted the Insomniac logo down onto the ground before being bashed off the cliff by Spyro. From there, we followed the purple dragon as he glided around a small island as upbeat and adventurous music played. Showing us all the details of the island was a small preview of what was to come. Fully explorable levels that didn't have to sacrifice greatly on draw distance or graphics. With that, Spyro landed and the player was free to start the game. This was removed in the remake sadly, but we still get an opening cutscene here. Again, altered here in the remake, we see an interview where the Elder Dragons are being questioned about their worlds, and more specifically a villain named Nasty Gnorc. The dragons claim that he isn't a threat anymore, and even outright insult him, prompting a reaction from the big bad. The intimidation of Nasty Gnorc is toned way down in this remake, as he takes on an almost Homer Simpson appearance as he sits at home just watching TV. I never liked his redesign. Anyway, after the insults, the Gnorc snaps and launches a magical beam in the air, turning all the older dragons into crystal. From there, a smaller purple dragon named Spyro exclaims that he has some work to do, and thus, the adventure begins. And with that, we spawn into the Artisans' homeworld, the first major hub of the game. Smartly, Insomniac made their homeworlds into levels themselves, each containing the same types of collectibles and enemies as you'd find in any other level. Truth be told, Artisans is an underappreciated tutorial for a game, doing a lot to nudge the player in the right direction without overly telling them too much. It's a player-driven tutorial. It's about discovery, not being told what to do, and it makes for a strong start to the game. Playing around with the controls reveals Spyro's basic moveset. He can walk, he can jump, he can glide short distances, he can charge, which doubles as an attack, he can do a flame breath attack, he can look around the environment, and he can roll left and right. The most obvious thing to do in the opening seconds is walk forward to the giant crystallized dragon. By stepping on its base, it frees the creature from capture, and we meet Nestor.
Thank you for releasing me, Spyro. Free 10 dragons in the Artisan world, then find the balloonist. He'll transport you to the next world.
What about Nasty Gnorc? I'm going after him.
Find dragons first. That's all I can tell you.
This quick interaction gives us direction and characterization. Spyro is fired up, wanting to go straight after Nasty Gnorc. It says a lot about the character's eagerness to prove himself worthy of the older and bigger dragon's respect. At the same time, Nestor discourages this behavior, instead giving us a goal, to free 10 dragons and then talk to the balloonist to go to the next world. With that, we can move with purpose around this homeworld, looking for dragons and coming to terms with the mechanics. Most likely to catch the player's eye next is a portal that says Stone Hill, but more on that in a bit. Right next to it, we see some enemies. As we approach them, they scramble away, terrified of Spyro. These enemies can't hurt you, meaning the player is safe to experiment with the controls to find ways to dispatch of them. Some simple testing reveals that a flame attack or a charged run are more than enough to take them out. And with that, our basic attack pattern is established. By then, the player is likely to have noticed the colored gems scattered around the ground, including these ones on a hill. If you play around with the controls, you might find out that you can glide to it by jumping from the nearby hilltop. However, if you can't piece this together for yourself, another nearby dragon will tell you how gliding works. This particular dragon, Thomas, is down an offshoot of the main area, but a Gnorc will run down there if you don't kill it fast enough, which acts sort of as a guide. So in a way, it's enemies, dragons, and gems all tying together to teach the player the fundamentals. Back to those gems though, and it's clear they are of importance. The dragon in the opening cutscene mentioned all the treasure they held and how Nasty Gnorc could turn treasure into soldiers for his army. By disposing of enemies, we get that treasure back. It becomes another staple collection piece, joining the crystallized dragons for now. And because Nestor highlighted dragons as the main collectible we need, it's clear that gem collection is more of an optional endeavor. Brilliant. As we continue to explore, more land is uncovered when the player checks down offshoots from the main part of the level. Vertical movement is very limited in the Artisans' homeworld, meaning there aren't a lot of opportunities to get lost, making sure new and younger players can keep up with others. We find another dragon in front of a giant dragon head. He tells us this is a boss door and it won't open until we complete at least one other level in the Artisans' homeworld. It gatekeeps a tough foe while also pointing players towards the other levels. Again, it's a nudge, not a shove. The final dragon tells us more about our companion Sparks, a dragonfly who's been hovering alongside of us the entire time. He says to keep an eye on Sparks because the dragonfly acts as a protector, absorbing damage until he disappears. I'll talk more about Sparks later, but I love this dragon's position. The enemies here can't hurt you, falling great distances doesn't hurt you, so why talk about damage now? Well, only one thing can damage you here in Artisans: the water. Delbin's position right next to it provides context for any damage the player may have received so far by jumping in. Another example of giving us a little insight without stopping the game outright or forcing us down a set path. It's about player discovery. So in just one world, the player is free to learn a lot on their own terms before venturing off to another level. We learn how to move, how to jump, how to attack, how to glide, how Sparks works, how to break chests, and more, while being given a direct goal of freeing 10 dragons. We've gotten 4 so far, 6 to go, so with the basics established, we can move into our first stage. Stone Hill is an excellent follow-up to Artisans' homeworld because it bumps up the challenge a tiny bit while still being a relatively easy level. Considering many players will be lured here through the gate we saw earlier before exploring all of Artisans, this was a smart choice. Keep it simple, but do just a bit more than the homeworld to signal that this is technically the second level, not the first. They acknowledge that players could find themselves in this level within 1 minute of starting the game, as is evidenced by how close the return home portal is to the beginning of this stage. A new player, especially the kids this game targeted, may have wandered into Stonehill Portal just to see what it does, and suddenly they find themselves in a whole new world. Being dropped into 2 levels so quickly might be overwhelming, and they may want to return back to Artisans. Well, they're in luck. All you have to do is walk forward down the most inviting of the castle doors, and you'll find a dragon and a way to go back. If you're a true video game novice, it's a chance to return quickly to the home world while also showing you how these levels will end. In other words, this portal is what you need to reach to end a stage. Lesson learned. However, placing the return portal so close to the beginning doesn't just help novices, it also signals a serious design philosophy of Spyro the Dragon. The game isn't going to be strictly linear levels like in 2D platformers. There's going to be other optional areas to explore if you want to collect everything. You may stumble into the return home portal quickly and realize, hey, wait a minute, there were other tunnels and a well back there. Maybe I should check those out first. and when you do, you're rewarded with gems and dragons, which reinforces player exploration, a critical mindset to getting the most enjoyment out of the game. And from there, you start exploring and learning more while having fun. There's the sequences where you line up a charge attack and smash through 5 metal chests at a time, which remains satisfying even if they change the sound effect here in Reignited. And there's also enemies that will challenge you back, like sheep that will rush you and shepherds who aren't afraid to take a swing. And there's even a locked chest that won't budge against a charge or a flame attack. The padlock on the front signals that you're probably gonna need a key. And all of this is found on the ground level or one step down in the case of the well, but Stone Hill doesn't stop there. I mean, it's called Stone Hill for a reason. Why wouldn't you be able to go up? Coming out of one of the tunnels, the player will notice a room being guarded, and inside is a sparkle whirlwind. Clearing out the guards and stepping into it takes you to the top, where a dragon reminds you of how to glide. With this reminder and the hill just sitting right there, it's only natural for players to take that next logical step. Literally, jumping off the platform and coasting over to the hill. It's one of those awesome video game moments where you feel like you've gone out of bounds, like you're somewhere you're not meant to be, even though you very much are. It's the game indicating to the player that they're going to have to be mindful of all platforms, as there's plenty of hidden optional areas throughout the game. By making this one so easy to stumble into, they establish that mindset early, which again is pivotal for the full experience. And you're rewarded again with more gems and of course your first egg thief, but more on those later. Arguably though, the biggest reward for climbing the hill is the vantage point it gives you over the return home portal. You can see a beach below that wasn't super obvious before. By jumping down, you find a hidden room that contains a key to unlock that chest from earlier. It all comes full circle. Find the lockbox easily, keep exploring as much as you can, and be rewarded by finding the key that unlocks it along with more gems. Just really good level design that once again promotes player exploration. Stone Hill is awesome. Dark Hollow is another relatively short level for easing the player in. There's only 100 gems and 3 dragons to find, along with another one of those lockboxes. The collectibles are kept light because, ultimately, Dark Hollow is about teaching the player combat basics. Sure, they've probably come to understand most of it by the time they reach this 3rd level, but if not, you will by the end of this one. So many enemies are put right in the critical path, forcing a confrontation. Right away, an enemy with a metal shield comes at you and hides behind it. A flame attack will not work, as the metal absorbs or deflects your flame. Only a charge attack will take this enemy out. Simultaneously, there's giant Gnorcs who won't die to a charge attack, as Spyro can't output enough force to topple these massive enemies. Instead, a flame attack is used to beat them. The dragons of this world will tell you more about combat, but I do question their placement a little bit. The first one, Alban, isn't too bad, as you can access him before a direct confrontation with 2 metal Gnorcs and a giant Gnorc. You can platform up to him, hear his tip, and then act accordingly. I think he would have been better placed right at the start to hear this tip before fighting anything, but it's fine I suppose. Darius, on the other hand, is found right at the end of the level and tells us that a quick flame will dispatch giant Gnorcs. Of course, by the time the player reaches this dragon, they've already seen probably 4 or 5 of these dudes, and so the tip sort of rings hollow. It's like someone explaining how a pawn moves in chess after you've played 4 games. In a way, I can forgive it, because the game is more experimentation oriented, but if a tip is deemed worthy enough to tell the player outright, then it probably should be said before it's relevant, not after. I do like that all of this comes to a head though in the level's optional area, where tight hallways are patrolled by giant Gnorcs in armor. The size tells us a charge won't work, and the metal tells us a flame won't work. But then you notice those unprotected backsides, and it all becomes obvious. Fire up the butts, and you're rewarded with a 3rd dragon and the key to the lockbox. All in all, another good level that somewhat stumbles in teaching us the combat basics. The last regular level in Artisans is Town Square, and our main lesson here is on gliding. We got a taste of it in the last few levels, but both could be completed without gliding once, and that's not the case here. Town Square makes you prove that you understand how to glide by starting the level with a large gap. The dragon here will tell you that you must glide across, and a later one will remind you that jumping as high as you can before starting your glide will maximize the distance that you can travel. This is the third dragon to tell us this now, but it's a really important point because so many areas will be inaccessible if you don't jump high enough. Case in point, to reach the egg thief of this level, you'll have to maximize your jump before starting the glide. The thing I love about this is how it's a little hidden, but not too hidden. The early gaps in the level are obvious. The walls are too high or there's a water pit below. It's easy to deduce that gliding is the answer, even if you skip the dragon's dialogue. However, to reach the egg thief and the second half of the level, you'll have to be mindful of potential vantage points. At the level's end, you can see another dragon on the platform above, but there's no obvious way to get there. There's nothing to be climbed, no sparkle whirlwind, and no way to jump up there. So you probably turn around looking for something you may have missed, and lo and behold, there's this elevated platform just sitting here for seemingly no reason. Why raise up this piece of terrain instead of having everything be flat? Well, that's because this is the jumping off point. By leaping, gliding, and wrapping around this pillar, you come to the area where you saw the egg thief mocking you earlier. You can chase him down and get the egg, but there's so much more. By gliding over another gap, you find more treasure, and then repeating the process brings you to the dragon you found earlier, not to mention with a bunch of yellow gems worth 10 points, which is pretty valuable compared to what you've seen so far. Some gems are even trapped in new chest types like this one that requires flame breath to charge it up like a wind turbine. It's a small way of alleviating the monotony of smashing the same chest over and over again. The gliding mechanic is established thoroughly here. Not only is it mandatory to finish the level in the basic sense, but it's also required to nab all the collectibles, along with a little bit of player-driven experimentation. It's another strong level in the Artisans' homeworld. That brings us to our first boss level of the game, Toasty. In these levels, Spyro has to overcome a tough enemy to reach the level's end, and here it's probably the most feared enemy in the entire game. The shepherd dogs, of course. What? You thought I meant Toasty? Hell no! These dogs are absolutely wicked. I'm sure as a youngster, these dogs were the bane of many players' existence, as they make this level far more difficult than anything we've seen so far. So, why is that? Well, first of all, they absorb 2 hits of damage instead of just 1. We've seen enemies that do this already, but they didn't attack back, they just ran away. The dogs do not. Upon being startled, they will jump up into the air and hover to your position before ground pounding. Their reach is pretty insane, not too crazy, but it definitely feels longer than it should. Oh, and they are also immune to charge despite their relatively small size, which is honestly the most egregious problem here. It breaks the established expectation, whereas the 2 hits and the extended reach are at least somewhat established before. Oftentimes, you'll go up to the dog, flame it, only to have it leap in the air and smash you, costing you a tick of health. Spyro can only absorb 4 hits before he dies, unless of course he kills a small creature to create a butterfly for Sparks to heal. Oh, and by the way, there's none of those in this level, which is insane. The most heavy combat challenge yet, and the game offers no chance for respite besides the checkpoints. That will make it a little easier to beat the level, but it's still no cakewalk for younger players. I find all of these factors to be legitimate complaints, but even considering it, I'm still okay with the inclusion of these dogs. The game has already established itself as being hands-off when it comes to tutorials, instead trusting you to figure it out for yourself. And when you experiment a bit, the dogs are not too bad. You can of course charge away after hitting them once, but this doesn't always work. Instead, utilizing the roll feature to dodge the follow-up slam is a good idea, but even better would be flaming them once, then jumping and flaming them again while they're in midair, neutralizing them before they even get a chance to strike. Both of these strategies make these encounters far easier. In a perfect world, I think a dragon should have been included near the level start that reminds you about your roll ability, since it's most likely to be the mechanic that goes unexplored the most. That would give the player a solid tip before sending them into a level with a lot of these dog enemies. As it is now, it's a hard challenge, but not an insurmountable one. As for Toasty himself, he's fine. He takes 3 hits to kill and can strike back, but will seem like child's play after the dog gauntlet. I think it was smart then to make him memorable in other ways. He presents as an intimidating scarecrow with a giant scythe, but bravery in attack reveals him to be nothing more than a sheep on stilts. I think it's a decent little reminder for young children to face your fears, so long as you can do so in a safe and controlled way. Like in a video game. Kinda wholesome, right? Okay, I kept a secret from you in the Artisans' homeworld. By the waterfall where we freed Delbin, there's a hidden level. By jumping on all the stone platforms, the tiles shift, revealing a level called Sunny Flight. First of all, I think hiding a level like this is really cool, especially one that's strictly optional for the story. It's a way of giving the player a cool moment without gatekeeping progression. That being said, Sunny Flight is wild. Unlike anything the player has seen yet. The quote-unquote flight levels are just that, flights. Spyro's gliding limitation is suddenly removed as he's able to free fly around the level. You notice that first, as well as a giant timer in the corner ticking down. Keep in mind, nothing has been explained to the player about what they are to do. They get a system shock seeing Spyro fly, the pressure of a timer expiring, and not a lot of insight on what they are to be doing. If any level in the game needed a proper tutorial, it was probably this one. Again, it's not too hard to figure out, fly around the map and destroy the 4 objects before time expires, but the initial shock will throw some people off. I'll talk more about these flight levels as we reach them, but I'm gonna wrap up Sunny Flight on that note. There isn't a ton to say about these levels, so I'll try to break it up, I guess, but for now, let's just say it comes at you really quickly and will probably require a few attempts on a first playthrough. After a short walk, we arrive at the balloonist who upholds his promise to fly us to Peacekeepers. I love the little detail that Toys for Bob left in here where Spyro jumps on his head to climb into the balloon. Anyway, arriving to Peacekeepers and the atmosphere and environment alone suggest a new level of danger. The strong horn music sounds like a war theme, and the dry and bleak desert is much more harsh than the quiet grasslands we just came from. It's a sign that we've entered somewhere tougher. The Peacekeepers' homeworld is a large circle, and at first, you can only move towards your left. The enemies here have a lot of character. There's of course the iconic Gnorcs who scramble at the sight of you, taking refuge in nearby tents until you burn them down, or they proceed to moon Spyro when he isn't looking. I'm surprised they were able to keep the butts in all their glory, but yeah, they're here, look at them. They also stop the charade and get scared the second you start looking at them, which is a cool detail as well. More interesting though would be the other enemies found here, the Cannonball Captains as I like to call them. These Gnorcs will run to the nearest cannon, rotate it, and fire off shots at Spyro so long as he is within distance. This is a cool little touch, but it's also used to inform the player of the cannon's mobility. In order to 100% complete Peacekeepers, the player will have to rotate and use the cannons. By having these Gnorcs do it first, the player gets the natural inclination to try it themselves, and once again, say it with me, they are rewarded for doing so. There's metal chests that can't be smashed open and don't have a key, requiring the cannon fire to take them out. There's also a stone pillar that now has a giant target on it, which I don't remember the original game having, I could be wrong. Anyway, blowing that up opens another part of the level where there's an egg thief, more gems, and another flight level. Interestingly enough, by the third dragon, there's also a key to a chest. This is the first time the player is likely to find the key before the chest, and it may send them into a mad scramble to see what they missed. The game trusts you to keep moving forward and being aware of your surroundings. There's a climbable rock formation you can use to glide over to a hidden cave where the locked box is found. It's something I don't think I ever found while playing through the game as a kid, but have of course discovered in the years since. Either way, it's another cool little secret place to find. Oh, and did you know, if you found all the treasure in all of the Artisans worlds, and then found it all here in the Peacekeepers homeworld, you can skip the rest of the levels here and go right to Magic Crafters. That's wild. Dry Canyon is the level where it feels like the training wheels have fully come off. There's plenty of different enemy types that can all damage you in different ways. The armored guards, the big Gnorcs, and even vultures who will fly at you from a distance. Even a BS one that will hit you around this corner before you even see it coming. At the same time, to nab all the gems and dragons, you'll have to really spend some time studying the environment for secret areas. There's 400 gems to find, double the amount you've been asked to seek out so far, indicating we've gone up another level here. Plenty of optional areas to uncover here in Dry Canyon. The first of these secret areas is somewhat easy to spot. By gliding to this alcove, you'll find a hidden door that leads down to a lot more enemies, gems, and even a lockbox, which is cool. Jumping off this platform drops you right off at the end of the level, and it's one of 3 different ways to reach that point, which I think is cool. No matter what path you take, it all leads to the end. Anyway, there's this one we just took, the main path, and the really secret one. As you play, you may notice a dragon way up on a high ledge that seems unreachable. Meanwhile, another dragon nearby will tell you that Dry Canyon rewards great gliding, and this is your only real hint of reaching that high up ally. By studying the environment, you may realize that there's an opening that you can glide out of, but you'll have to take a real leap of faith. The path to your left is blocked by the cliff wall, but by gliding all the way around it, you can land on the hidden alcove and nab the dragon and the key to the lockbox. It's one of a few instances in which the game rewards blind faith or the effort it takes to really analyze every part of a level, and it's really satisfying to pull off. Towards the end of the level, I went to kill an enemy for its gem, but accidentally stepped on the return home portal first. I knew I had to go back to nab the rest of the treasure, and it afforded me the opportunity to talk about how lives work in Spyro. Again, more on Sparks later, but when he's gone and you get hit, Spyro dies and you lose 1 life, respawning at the nearest checkpoint, or if you're out of lives, getting a game over that kicks you back to the homeworld. But it's very possible to earn more lives in Spyro. To do this, you can eat blue butterflies that grant you a 1-up, you can break these purple cases to reveal a 1-up as well, and you can kill enemies you've already disposed of. In this case, each enemy will drop a little pearl, and when you collect enough of them to wrap around the Spyro logo, you'll get an extra life before the process restarts. It's like finishing a pearl necklace, which ties into the gem collection idea quite well. Honestly, it's hard to run out of lives in Spyro, so long as you can make it past Toasty's dogs relatively unscathed. Regardless, Dry Canyon is a great level, one that signals that the game has truly begun, and that the onus will be on you to uncover all of its secrets and collectibles. Clifftown has always been one of my personal favorite levels in this original Spyro, but I'm not totally sure why. It's sort of like Stonehill on steroids. There's more aggressive enemies, including these big cooking Gnorcs. I always liked that flaming their pots rewarded you with gems. You wouldn't think of them as normal chests, but they contain the same reward, which is kinda neat. I also love the big glide over the river, which decidedly feels smaller here in the remake. I think it's because the draw distances are much clearer here, and the fuzzy graphics of the original made it seem further away. So when you did the big glide, it really felt like a big glide. Still, I like it, and the gems hidden behind the opening temple, it's all great stuff. But before we get too far into this video, I wanted to mention a big reason that I felt alright using footage from the Reignited trilogy versus the original game. Again, I wanted to go OG, trust me, I really did. But once I heard about the so-called Spyroscope that Toys for Bob used while developing the remake, I felt a lot better about my choice. During the development of the Reignited trilogy, the team did not have access to the original code for the first 3 games. With a very tight deadline to get the project done, the team used emulation technology for data collection. Essentially, they ran the games and used software dubbed the Spyroscope that would gather information about each level's layout. In an article I found on IGN, they interviewed some members of the development team. On the Spyroscope, Paul Yen, the co-studio head, said, quote, "We basically had the entire game running, then simultaneously, this tool is pulling numbers and data on everything. Coordinates for the level mesh, the placements for every single character, for every single gem, and the value of what those gems are." End quote. In essence, the Spyroscope is what allowed the team to get everything right as they rebuilt the game from the ground up, including all new character models, animations, levels, and more. This invaluable tool no doubt went a long way in allowing the remakes to be as praised as they were, especially this first game that feels the most finished and polished out of the 3. Because Toys for Bob made such an effort to painstakingly recreate these levels as best they could, I felt comfortable using the remake as the foundation for this video. I'm not saying the team got everything perfect, as we will see later on, but for now, suffice it to say, it's good enough for me. Ice Cavern provides a nice change of pace aesthetically compared to the other levels in Peacekeepers. The harsh desert sun is replaced with frozen ice in a series of platforms and snowy caverns. This level is quite linear compared to most others, as there is a set route to get through, nabbing up gems along the way. Despite the emphasis on linearity, the level remains quite fun to go through because of a few new variations. This includes these big armored Gnorcs that you have to shove off of cliffs using your charge ability, as well as these gems stuck on top of poles that you must charge to knock free. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's a tiny change that makes things feel fresh. It does enough to avoid the monotony, and that's always appreciated. There's another 400 gems to collect, along with 5 dragons, that being the most we've seen in a level so far. With more collectibles than any other level yet, it was smart to make it a touch more linear to ensure the player would probably stumble into it all. Of course, they retained that patented Spyro freedom by having a whole optional area found after the return home portal. And of course, yes, I see you mega Spyro fan in the comments telling me that players can skip right to the end of the level with a leap of faith glide. Yep, I went back and did it just to get those 3 extra lives. Can't be letting those just lay around. That brings us to our second boss level of the game, Dr. Shemp. It starts with a linear section in which you must avoid kamikaze chefs as their suit mama overlords send them barreling towards you. Funny enough, if you sidestep them, they just run off the edge and you earn their gems. A secret whirlwind also grants some extra gems, but that's it outside of the boss fight. Dr. Shemp himself is a step up from Toasty, at least in a one-on-one sense. Toasty is still harder because of the dogs, but he didn't do much all by himself. Shemp is not the same. The dragon before the fight gives you a quick tip on how to defeat him, saying that he really needs to watch his back. This is a clue to the player that the metal plate doesn't extend to his backside. By now, the player should have probably learned this lesson from their time in Dark Hollow, but a reminder's always nice. Shemp himself has 3 different attacks, but he only uses one at a time. He starts with an overhead swing in which he runs at you first. This running opens up his backside, cluing the player in on what they need to hit, and making it easier to do that. On the final 2 platforms, he doesn't chase you much, instead doing a spin overhead attack in which his back is briefly exposed, and then a spin move where the same weakness is shown. He really isn't a tough boss, but in a way, he's a step up from Toasty. I'm not a big fan of his redesign here, as I think some of the original charm is lost, but you could say that about a lot of things in this remake. I don't know, Dr. Shemp was always my favorite boss in the OG, and I think it's because he seemed bigger there and more intimidating as a result. Here, he just comes off as a bit goofy, like many enemies do, unfortunately. Night Flight is definitely a step up from what the player experienced in Sunny Flight. There, the player had to form their own route a little bit more, but each target they destroyed granted them 3 seconds. Here, that isn't the case. Sure, the path between the targets is much more linear, as it's pretty simple to figure out the order you're meant to collect them in, but that doesn't make it easier necessarily. It takes some precise flying, as you're expected to bob and weave a lot more, whether it's quick dips to hit an archway or a sudden pull up to take out a chest. Arguably though, the hardest thing to nab are the lighthouses, which are the last target to be taken down. Maybe I'm just bad, that really could be the case, but the last lighthouse was hard to find and it took me a good 5 to 6 runs before I beat Night Flight. And when I did, I barely scraped by with just a few seconds left. In a perfect world, the player might have been given an extra 2 to 3 seconds at the start to hedge against the fact that they won't be super familiar with the flight controls, given this is only the second level, and they're also inverse controls. But yeah, I think it's fine. It's a good challenge, and making the player attempt something a few times doesn't mean it's poorly designed. It's just that, I guess. A good challenge. Much like Ice Cavern, Magic Crafters is structured more linearly, but honestly, it's my favorite of the homeworlds. The aesthetic is just really cool, and there's a few hidden secrets like this house on the pond that contains a key that will unlock this chest that requires another Leap of Faith glide. But the two things that really elevate this homeworld would be the enemies and the introduction of Supercharge.
Supercharge?
I'll talk about Supercharge more in an upcoming stage, but the Wizards of Magic Crafters are such an awesome enemy. They don't try to hurt you directly, as instead, they manipulate the environment to cause you pain. For example, this wizard will push a cliff wall out to try to knock you into the water, whereas this one will raise a platform with gems. If you jump at the wrong time, you'll also end up in the water. It's nothing revolutionary, but it's just another new fresh idea that the game is throwing in to go alongside its other standard enemies. Magic Crafters gives us a real break from the regular Gnorcs we've been fighting so far. There's 3 dragons to free in this homeworld, but it's Cosmos here who asks us to free the dragons, collect the treasure, and most importantly, to stop the egg thieves. I've encountered enough of these pesky blue-robed men already, plus there's 2 more to be found here, so now seems like a good time to share my thoughts on them. Generally, I think they were a good inclusion, if not a little bit underwhelming. The challenge with them is, of course, to chase them down. They move extremely fast, but they run the same route repeatedly. At this point, the player should realize that the challenge is to run that same route as the egg thief, except to do it more efficiently by cutting corners and choosing the optimal time to strike. I can't say this with 100% certainty, but it's my belief that each thief has a set point in which they are meant to be caught. There's a moment in each of their runs where they take a corner turn a bit wider than they need to, providing that moment to attack. It's up to the player to keep up until this moment presents itself by avoiding the walls that each thief generally runs so close to. It makes for a fun little challenge that isn't going to be overly taxing. There's a lot of intrinsic satisfaction derived from catching one of them after hearing them snicker at you for so long. It feels like proving yourself to the game, pushing back against something that's mocking you and showing them that you can indeed catch them, and I like that element of it. But it's a good thing that the intrinsic reward is so satisfying, as ultimately, the recovered eggs don't do anything at all. Outside of those bragging rights, you don't receive much else. I think it would have been cool if the eggs would have hatched into baby dragons, or at least given you an extra life or something. It's just strange to spend the whole game seeing them stack up on your screen, and then that's just it. It's done. You got them all. Good job. Here's a quick peek at them one last time, and then boom, that's it. They're gone. I don't know. It's just a bit weird. Overall, though, like I said, I think the Egg Thieves were a good inclusion and are arguably one of the most recognizable enemies from the entire series. Alpine Ridge is where you really start to see the game utilize more bottomless pits in the level design. This isn't Stone Hill anymore, where you can just free roam around at your leisure. You're farther into the game now, and it's going to start testing your platforming skills a little bit more. Now, this is nothing too crazy, but it is for sure a step up from what's come before, and that's something that's going to be built on for the remainder of the game, requiring the player to glide more often and to make sure they do it right to avoid damage and death. Besides this though, Alpine Ridge is a pretty straightforward level, so now makes for a good time to discuss Sparx the Dragonfly. Finally. Let me be upfront, I think Sparx was a brilliant inclusion for this title. It's clear the team didn't want Spyro to be susceptible to one-hit KOs. In a game targeting a younger audience, dying to one hit may frustrate and discourage them from continuing. At the same time, the new 3D technology that Insomniac was using allowed them to display more parts of their levels even from faraway distances. They wanted the player to feel the scope of these levels and to appreciate the freedom that a killer view could promise. You know what might take away from that? A HUD element that constantly showed the player's health. I mean, if you don't die in one hit, how else would you know where you stand health-wise? Well, enter Sparx, the perfect solution. The Dragonfly doesn't do a whole lot in this first game, but he's certainly a welcome companion. He's a cute friend in a hostile world, one that is always along for the ride without ever slowing the player down or interrupting your exploration. But he's more than just a friendly face. He of course acts as a health meter, starting at gold, turning blue upon one hit, green upon 2 hits, and disappears after 3, meaning Spyro will perish on that 4th hit. 4 hits before dying seems like an appropriate amount for a game of this nature, but it's also appreciated that you can restore health by knocking out the tiny creatures and eating the butterflies that spawn. It's perhaps a little strange that Sparx just kind of materializes out of thin air upon knocking out one of these little creatures after you've lost him, but it's fine. It's a great way of always informing the player on where they stand health-wise, but again, there's more to it. Sparx loves treasure just as much as you do, and is willing to grab nearby gems so long as you come close to it. Spyro himself doesn't even have to touch it, as long as he's close, Sparx will nab it up. It's a brilliant little way of helping the player, especially that targeted younger audience who may just be learning how a controller works. And then, when Sparx is gone, you really feel his absence, as you have to be a little bit more precise with your movements. You have to get that treasure yourself. No one's gonna do it for you. I think all of these factors go a long way in endearing Sparx to the player, while also making him mechanically rich for such a small NPC. I mean, here I am at age 30, and every time I see Sparx turn blue or green, I'm frantically searching for a way to get the little guy back to that shiny gold. There's a tiny attachment there that has really endured over the years. Sparx is brilliant in so many ways, you gotta love him. High Caves is such a memorable level, and I think it's because it throws so many new things at you at once. Right as you spawn in, there's a cave with spiders who can't be flamed or charged to death, making them seem invulnerable. At the same time, you start to see enemies fighting each other in the form of these tornado dudes and blue wizards, all the while the druids from the homeworld continue to wreak havoc by moving everything around. And then later there's even this fairy who gives Spyro a temporary buff to his flame, allowing him to kill any enemy. But all of these new things are overshadowed by one other new thing, and it's a ramp. Supercharge is such an underrated mechanic found here in Spyro 1. It will be put to even greater use in an upcoming level, but it makes its debut in High Caves, at least when talking about the stages. Supercharge is a buff to Spyro's charged attack, but it only lasts for as long as the player is able to maintain their hold on that square button while also not crashing into anything or falling off a ledge. Basically, it can be used to smash up seemingly impenetrable objects or enemies, and can be used to soar great distances during a glide. It's versatile and fun to get the hang of. It's what we end up using to destroy those armored spiders in the caves, and it also allows us to reach some faraway areas to nab up the treasure strewn about. It's sort of like a power rush. It really feels like Spyro got a hold of that star power-up in Mario, making him invincible. Of course, by tying it back into player skill, it makes learning the movement an adventure in of itself. I can't remember how many times I went after an armored spider only to miss, crash into a wall, and have it charge at me. You then had to do that frightened run out of the cave, trying to avoid them as best you could. It created a story in my childhood that I still remember to this day, because that definitely happened as a kid, and for sure did not happen on this playthrough. No, not even once. I'm an adult. You think I messed up the supercharge? Yeah, that didn't happen. Anyway, Supercharge is what allowed those memorable events to occur, and I think it was a great inclusion. It switches up the gameplay while empowering the player, and I think that's a win. Wizard Peak feels like one of those levels where the developers decided to kick up the challenge another notch in both exploration and combat. When searching for gems, you'll have to get pretty creative. Right at the start of the level, there's a very easy to miss pathway that hosts a lot of shinies. This path will take you alongside the mountains, making you feel like you've gone out of bounds once again. And then, later on, to nab the last few gems, you'll have to use a supercharged ramp to leap up and take out a wizard to nab his gems, along with those in these chests. It can certainly take a few attempts, which can be somewhat annoying, given you know the solution, but are just struggling to pull it off. Still, it's nothing more than a minor nuisance, and it is satisfying to finally get it right. And then of course there's the far off platforms that require the supercharge to reach, forcing you to think outside the box a little bit once more. It's all good stuff. There's also an enemy type here that has more close combat range than most you've seen so far. He's quick to smack you with his club, meaning it's better to do a bait and switch. Get close enough to draw out the attack without taking damage, and then move in for the kill as it recovers. You'll learn this solution after a few encounters, so pairing him up with a few ranged enemies helps keep things frantic for a few seconds, which is great. So yeah, Wizard Peak gets a thumbs up. After so many great memories and new mechanics introduced in Magic Crafters, it's a shame that it ends with such a thud. Blowhard is by far the easiest boss level we've encountered so far, making me feel like he'd be more at home in Artisans than Magic Crafters. At least there, he would have been the first boss of the game, explaining away the easier difficulty. Blowhard is so easy because the level features Magic Crafters' weakest foes, the druids who don't attack you, and the lightning wizards that are pretty easy to dodge. At the same time, Blowhard himself is a total pushover. He hesitates to attack you, and when he finally gets around to doing it, there's plenty of time as he casts the tornado spell and pushes it towards you. Simply rushing his position quickly with a flame breath will dispatch of him without any trouble. It's especially weird considering the previous levels weren't afraid to turn up the difficulty a bit with the armored spiders and the faster reacting Gnorcs. But oh well. As it is, I completed this level in under 4 minutes, and that includes going back to pick up a gem that I left laying around. Blowhard is forgettable. Jeez, talk about quick levels, man. I just beat Crystal Flight in under 2 minutes in one attempt. I hardly even have any footage to show you. It's another flight level, which means, yet again, nabbing all 4 targets before the timer expires. This one was easier than Night Flight because it demanded less precision flying. Really, the gimmick here is spawning in with things flying right at you, making it hard to decide what to target first, as it throws you for a loop. Settling in past that inertia-filled opening sees the level get a lot easier, and I finished it with over 4 seconds remaining, despite probably not even taking the best route. And with that, we're set to head to Beastmakers. Of course, if you haven't recovered enough dragon eggs yet, the balloonist will not take you. I always found it strange that game progression was locked behind this, considering it might be kinda tough for young children to catch the egg thieves, but they only ask you to get 5, so maybe it's not that bad. I mean, that's not even half of them. Arriving to Beastmakers and the dim, swampy mess sure does provide a different aesthetic after the peaceful and snow-covered mountains of Magic Crafters. Toys for Bob really did do an immaculate job when it comes to re-envisioning how these levels and worlds would look, especially because the PS1 game didn't have a lot of detailed work for them to copy. It feels like the original was like a foundation, and they did a good job of building it up here. While traversing through Beastmakers, I came to appreciate a mechanic I sort of overlooked earlier when talking about gliding, and that would be the instant stop. By pressing triangle during any part of a glide, Spyro will simply fall down. While it isn't super useful, there are a few occasions where you'd overshoot a glide, and being able to cancel out of the animation at any time really helps prevent a lot of unnecessary damage and deaths. I noticed it here while gliding to some of these platforms. Being able to stop on a dime just felt nice. It's a mechanic that would be evolved in Spyro 2 with the hover, in which Spyro would get a little extra altitude at the end of a glide, but the stop works well for this game. I'm glad Toys for Bob had the awareness to not bring the hover backwards into this game like they did with another feature that I'll discuss in a moment. Platforming in this game would be a lot easier with the hover. Not to mention, I'm sure there's a few instances in which the intended experience in some levels would just be shattered if the player could get that additional hover boost. So kudos for being smart enough to not bring it backwards. Before we jump into our first stage here, I wanted to briefly mention the guidebook. Again, this was initially introduced in the sequel, but unlike the hover, this was a worthwhile thing to bring backwards into the first game. It's a harmless tool that can only help the player. Essentially, it keeps track of your progress in every level, telling you if you've missed any dragons, gems, or eggs, while also giving you a completion percentage for each stage. It also allows you to fast travel back to any previous homeworld or stage, which is super convenient and appreciated. I mean, the original game had a pause screen that showed you what you were missing, but making it into the guidebook here really ties everything together. I think it was a smart choice to bring this back, and it's going to help anyone who wants to go for full completion. The thick grasses of Terrace Village are really good at obscuring some of the gems, making this a tougher level than others to grab them all. In this playthrough, I haven't struggled to 100% any level so far, but I think that's because I've finished this game to full completion so many times. Still, I did struggle to find a few gems at the end of this stage. Sticking with the theme of Toys for Bob's dilemma on what mechanics to bring backwards from the sequels, and we have another dealing with the gems. In the original Spyro, Sparks could not help you find gems. Again, if you were close enough he'd pick them up, but he couldn't point you in the direction of ones you were missing. However, this changed in Ripto's Rage, where he could just kind of point them out. Wherever the nearest gem was, he would point towards it. This made finding the last few easier because you could get a general idea of where they were. This feature was brought back in Year of the Dragon, but it had to be unlocked. Here in this remake, Sparks can locate the nearest gem for you in all 3 games from the very start, including here in Spyro 1. For me, I'm trying to play as a purist, so that meant not using the feature at all during any part of this run. It certainly would have made the game easier and will be a great help to many younger players, so I'm not necessarily against its inclusion. With how many secret little nooks and crannies there are from level to level, I think it will go a long way in helping newer players reach 100%. My concern is that a lot of satisfaction is lost by using it. There's a primal joy that comes from exploring each level to its fullest on your own terms. I've already mentioned how player-driven and experienced Spyro 1 is, and finding the gems on your own supports that principle. Having Sparks automate the process does take away from that a bit, but overall, it's optional whether you use it or not, so I think it's fine. By the way, I love the enemy designs in this level. The Swamp of Beastmakers and its stages all utilize natural imagery in their design. While this is true of many levels in Spyro 1, the uglier and less pristine side of Mother Nature is best felt in the dingy, murky waters and overgrowth of Beastmakers. The natural elements are untamed, unkept, and tapped into far more than in any other homeworld or stages. So what better enemies to place in it than a bunch of metalheads? No pun intended. The emphasis on electricity and metal are so diametrically opposed to the natural feeling, making these enemies stick out like a sore thumb, almost like the Gnorcs are parasites infecting the stage. It makes you want to smash them up to restore that balance, while also introducing a new enemy type, one who makes the environment the element of damage instead of just a sheer swing of a club.
Watch out, Spyro! The Gnorcs in these pods have discovered the power of electricity, and it really stings.
Maybe I'm overthinking it, but the way the environment and the enemies stood opposed against one another always seemed really cool to me. It was evident in the original game, and the details afforded by the remake allowed that idea to come through even clearer. Let me tell you something about Misty Bog. I got wrecked many times. There's 5 different enemy types here, and 4 out of 5 of them will destroy you. These moving plants with mouths lunge at you with quick speed. The attack frogs can hit you from distance with their tongues, and pairing them up with flame-resistant enemies makes for a challenge. And the boars are just not afraid to run you or anything else over. In my research, I saw a lot of talk about how Spyro enemies were different from most 3D platformers because they could target you for attacks instead of just moving in preset pathways, and I think you really feel that in Misty Bog. All the foes make for a combat gauntlet, resulting in this level being one of the most challenging across the entire game. Of course, it also taps into something that I think quietly made Spyro such a smash hit: enemy placement. Yes, some enemies are tough, but in most levels, they aren't. And even here, where they can beat up on you, there's still a few instances where their placement is meant to enrich your experience, not by challenging you, but by empowering you. So many times through Spyro 1, enemies are aligned perfectly for Spyro to do a charged attack through them all, resulting in a quick hit of dopamine. I should note that they also aren't afraid to do the same thing with chests, lining up a bunch in a line so that the player can blast through them all in a charge of violent delight. Think about it, you're taking out many foes and collecting a bunch of gems in just a few short seconds. Between that and the satisfying sound effects that play, how could you not feel a rush? The alignment of enemies in this way was a deliberate choice made by Insomniac, and it was brilliant. Every dragon, gem, egg, and enemy is a quick moment of player interaction, but when you pile up a few of these things in a really short time frame and allow the player to overcome it with seemingly no struggle, it is so satisfying. The game utilizes this frequently without dipping into it so much that it would lose its potency, and it's just really excellent design. It's an element that might go underappreciated since those moments are over so quickly, so I felt it was important to shout it out in this video. Well done, Insomniac. And with that, we reach the most famous or infamous level within all of Spyro 1. Treetops, an absolute maze of a level if you're going for 100% completion. This is the stage that takes the small open world levels of Spyro to its logical conclusion, providing a ton of opportunity for experimentation and exploration, more so than any other stage across the game. When following just the intended pathway, it's very easy to reach the level's end with less than half of the total gems and with the dragon still trapped. The cowards amongst us hop on that return home portal and cut their losses, but not for us, not on this channel, we go for the gold. The key to finishing up this stage fully is what our good friend Lyle has to say. He mentions that to see the treetops to their fullest, the player will have to use multiple supercharged ramps at once. There's 2 parts of the level that seem unreachable at first glance: a cliff above the return home portal, as well as a distant island where a dragon waits in slumber. I'm pretty proud to say that despite not playing this game since release in 2018, I actually managed to remember the pathways on my own, although it did take a few attempts to get things right. I found myself falling into those bottomless pits a few times, but doing so allows for faster attempts since you can spawn right back at Lyle's location. And to offset the deaths, the developers included a generous number of 1-up chests within this stage, and that was smart. It's a good way of offsetting the frustration of trying to find your way through the maze. I eventually got to both islands by remembering this big right hook you must do off the second supercharge ramp to reach the third, and eventually the fourth. The result was a ton of personal satisfaction and delight after struggling for a few attempts. It feels like the culmination of Spyro platforming across the entire game, and overcoming it leads to a lot of personal pride. It's weird that the pinnacle of platforming challenge comes about 60% of the way through the game though, instead of near the end, but the experience itself makes up for that oddity. Treetops is an awesome level and perhaps the biggest evidence of Insomniac's focus on player-driven exploration across the game. The boss of Beastmakers is arguably the game's best, at least when looking at the entire package. Metalhead stage contains challenging enemies, many of which are immune to your flame attack, testing your charge move that hopefully you've practiced a lot in Misty Bog and Terrace Village. There's also perhaps the most well-hidden area in the entire game. You've become so used to avoiding water that you'd hardly ever think twice about venturing down near it. Observant players, however, will notice this little patch that can be landed on right next to a gate that's partially broken. By hopping into the water and out the other side, the player can discover a hidden chamber full of more gems, a 1-up, and even a key to unlock a safe. The entrance to this area is so well hidden because it's down low, forcing you to look for it, and also because the water acts as a deterrent. I remember my first effort to 100% Spyro 1 was during my freshman year of college, and finding all the treasure in Metalhead was like the one time I had to look up a guide. Well, and maybe Treetops too, but still, it's an awesome secret. Metalhead himself is unlike any enemy we've fought yet. You can't damage him directly, but instead, you must charge into his power poles to knock them out. When green, you can charge them, but if they're red, you'll get zapped for a hit of damage. Since the poles are immune to flame, you have to get your timing right to charge them to avoid the pain. Not to mention, Metalhead himself can throw enemies at you and do a laser attack. It's nothing too crazy, but it provides a nice change of pace compared to the bosses that we've seen so far, and I like that. Alright, I still don't have a ton to say about the flight missions, but for what it's worth, I think Wild Flight is one of the better ones. It has a frantic opening, but this is the 4th time you've done this now, so you should be getting used to the controls. This level will test you on that front though, especially because 3 of the 4 targets are pretty low to water, meaning one slip up and the run is over. Not only is some precision flying required, but you'll also have to do a few attempts to find the optimal route. Never before has traveling against the direction of moving targets been more important, wasting time chasing boats and chasing planes instead of letting them come to you will result in a loss. It all combines to make for a pretty fun flying level. Dreamweavers is the last fully fleshed out homeworld, and it's the most dangerous yet. It's full of bottomless pits if you mess up a glide, and many enemies here can't be disposed of right away. The main gimmick of this world will be the changing size of enemies. A magical cannon blast will transform enemies from big to small, and vice versa, making charge and flame attacks an option depending on what happens. You go through the level, waiting for the cannon to provide an opportune time to strike, until you finally reach it and can take advantage of its power. There's 2 enemies that won't get shrunk on their own, but with the player at the helm, they can be miniaturized and taken out, unlocking another part of the level. It's a neat idea at the very least. The clock fools are also introduced here and will be used in a later stage. By hitting them, something in the world changes for a set period of time, usually a platform being moved, granting you access to new areas if you're fast enough to reach them. And that's pretty much Dreamweavers, a fun homeworld for sure. We've now seen dragons from 5 different realms, and with a thorough sample size, let's discuss the changes made to them here in the remake. In the original Spyro the Dragon, there were only 8 different character models for rescued dragons, but now every single dragon has been given a unique look. In fact, many of them lean into the aesthetic of the world they come from. You'll find dragons with weapons while in Peacekeepers, ones with wizard hats and magic crafters, spiritualist shamans in the swamps of Beastmakers, and more. These extra details suggest careers that dragons partake in, and I think it's a cool way of expanding the scope and lore of the dragon realms. Besides the updated graphics, it's the biggest change the Reignited trilogy makes to the originals, and here in the first game, I think it works. With that being said, part of the original charm of these dragons has been lost, but it's owed more to the voice acting than the appearance change. They are cartoonified just enough that many of them don't feel like the sage elders that they did in the original game. I think it's a subtle difference, but one that many returning players are surely going to notice. Toys for Bob didn't take a ton of creative liberty in the remake, but they certainly did here, and the perception of that is going to differ from player to player. Dark Passage is the first stage in the Dreamweaver's world, and it's another with a lot of optional content. Reaching the Return Home portal means only seeing about 40% of the stage, with the other 60% waiting behind this optional area that you'll have to look around for. It's the same design philosophy we've seen in so many levels continuing to grow and grow. Small but open worlds with tons of nooks and crannies. I also appreciate that many dragons here in Dreamweavers bring up Nasty Gnorc again. By this point, the player is nearing the end of the game, and could be forgiven for having forgotten about the big bad. It was a good idea to remind them as we get closer and closer to that confrontation. I don't have much more to say about Dark Passage, so instead, I wanted to briefly say that, overall, I think Toys for Bob did a good job giving the first Spyro game a big facelift. When you go back and watch footage of the original on PlayStation 1, it still holds up in a lot of ways. The polygonal shapes, enemy designs, and more had a charm all their own, but while that aspect has been lost here, so much more detail has been introduced that brings these worlds to life like never before. It's like a realized version of how our young minds saw those PS1 graphics using our imagination. Between the texture work, the redesigns, and especially the lighting, Toys for Bob did a great job of presenting these stages with modern looks while still being respectful to the source material. Honestly, I'd still rather play the originals, but until they get brought to modern consoles, this will suffice nicely to re-experience Spyro the Dragon. I will extend Toys for Bob a lot of credit for all their work that went into this remake in such a short amount of time. Make no mistake, the game looks great, but I will note that a distinct element of the presentation has been lost here: the atmosphere, and more on that a little later. Next up is Lofty Castle, perhaps the most dream-inspired level within all of Dreamweavers. It really does feel like an ethereal place, like you're floating somewhere in the heavens. We get a new enemy type here in the form of these balloon Gnorcs. Disposing of them means waiting for the opportunity to strike their balloon, sending them plummeting down. There's also another supercharged challenge, but it's nothing like what we saw in Treetops. Oh, and who could forget the Sparkle Whirlwind Fairies, who are felt most prominently in this level. Upon freeing them from their cages, they create Sparkle Whirlwinds, which allows Spyro to traverse vertically and glide to faraway places. It's an idea that defines the level. Nothing too special, but it's good to see them introducing new ideas even this late into the game. Overall, a good level, but not much more to say about it. However, what I will say is that I think one thing that has helped me cope with not being able to play the original game for this video is the inclusion of the 1998 OST. You really thought I was gonna go this entire video without conjuring up Stuart Copeland's name, didn't you? Look, if you've dabbled in even a small amount of Spyro trivia, you know damn well that the legendary drummer from The Police composed the music for the original Spyro trilogy. I hate to even waste time on it, but how can you not mention it when the music here is just so damn good? Most of the tunes were made on a synthesizer, which I think helped promote the ethereal feel of the game, letting the composer build some cool vibes that you might not find with a guitar or drums alone. Either way, I'm really glad Toys for Bob decided to include the original music as an option that can be turned on and off in the menus. I almost feel bad for the Reignited version of the original tracks because I can't see many OG fans using them when what they know and love is just right there readily accessible. For what it's worth, they did a good job of maintaining the original feel, but yeah, nothing's gonna beat that 98 soundtrack. You know, I think Haunted Towers is my favorite level in the entire game. I'd say this, Magic Crafters, and Cliff Town are my top 3, and by the way, I'd love to hear your top 3 levels in the comments below. Anyway, Haunted Towers ranks so high for me because it's a stage that both presents great challenge, but also great power. This level is all about power-ups, as we find both the souped-up Flame Breath and a supercharged ramp here, making both of Spyro's attacks much more formidable. Very quickly, the player learns that these Metal Knights can't be disposed of by normal means, but they soon come face to face with a fairy who gives you boosted Flame Breath, allowing you to destroy anything metal. Those knights suddenly become toast. The first part of this stage forces the player to learn this before opening up, as the knight in front of the critical path will block your progress until dealt with. It's a great way of teaching the player the mechanic, but it leaves me with 2 head scratchers. The first is that the dragon right after this tells you to utilize the fairy's kiss, which is a lesson we've clearly already learned by reaching this point. It makes the tip now just pointless, kind of like the ones back in Dark Hollow. It's also strange that we've already encountered this same power-up back in High Caves without any explanation. Its inclusion there seems very strange now, sort of like it should have happened after we learn more about the power-up here. Perhaps the player is meant to learn about the Flame Breath fairies here, and then take that knowledge back to High Caves, sort of like the dragon who tells you about the secret waterfall in Wizard Peak. But who knows? Anyway, the knights are spammed heavily throughout the level, and you'll often have to dodge their attacks to make your way to a fairy. Upon getting the kiss, you return to torch them. It's like a mini reward for proving you could get past them without dying, and it also makes you feel sort of badass, which is great. And then there's another supercharged ramp that seems out of place. Sure, there's some metal doors down here, but another fairy will give you Flame Breath that can destroy them. Well, by running this path exactly, you can reach a hidden side of the tower where a dragon, gems, and more knights await you, as well as a fairy who gives you permanent Flame Breath until you leave the level. The run up to this fairy is challenging though. If you take too long to platform up to her, another knight will block your progress, forcing you to restart. It pushes the player more than most levels. So yeah, Haunted Towers does a great job of providing peaks and valleys. The valleys being the struggle to get past the enemies unscathed, and the peaks being the return trip where you nuke them out of existence. I love it. The boss residing over Dreamweavers is the puppet Jacques, and he's another pushover. His fight is very similar to Blowhard, with maybe 10% more challenge owed to the glides you have to make. Basically, you chase him down, avoid the boxes he throws at you, and flame him every time he's on a box platform. Do this 3 times, and you win. The real test is just making sure you don't mess up the glide and plunge into the lava below. It's another underwhelming fight, and so now the only remaining hope to lift up these boss encounters is Nasty Gnorc, and we'll see how that fares shortly. Besides the fight, Jacques' level takes advantage of the clock fools we first encountered back in the homeworld. By attacking them, a countdown starts and the player has a limited time to pull off the platforming needed to progress before things return to the status quo. It's really not too challenging, but I do love that this level's optional offshoot isn't really that hidden. The dragon's just sitting there, and the question becomes, well, how do I reach it? The tall platform usually controlled by the clock fools is a great hint, and backtracking reveals a fool who seemingly does nothing to the platforms near him. By knocking his clock out, it lowers the pillar, allowing us to reach the optional area. Yet another think outside the box moment that rewards the player with the collectibles they've come to treasure most. Icy Flight serves as the conclusion to the flight levels, and they sort of go out with a whimper. That's nothing against this particular stage, as it's fine in its own right. Another instance of the player being challenged to find the best route for themselves through trial and error. It only took me 2 attempts to figure this pattern out, and I wrapped things up with more time to spare than ever before. So, yeah, kinda weak. It doesn't feel like I was pushed to my limits, but instead served another alright flight level. Overall, the flight stages do a decent job of changing up the gameplay, but I don't think enough went into them to make them feel special in this first game. The Gnorc Gnexus isn't much of a homeworld at all. Famously, Insomniac's time constraints quickened how fast this last world had to be made, and as a result, it's just a floating metal island. But unlike the other homeworlds, it can't be 100% completed on the first run. You'll have to finish a few of the stages to open up dragon mouths where more treasure awaits. So with that, let's jump into the first level. Gnorc Cove is another level that's centered around one mechanic, sort of like the Flame Breath power-up in Haunted Towers. Here, we have a lot of barrels. Enemies are constantly chucking 2 of them at you, both metal ones and TNT ones. With everything the player has learned so far, it's not hard to deduce that the metal ones can be charged, and that the TNT ones will explode if you use the Flame Breath. These barrels are used against you as weapons, but you can also turn the tide on your foes by launching them straight back. There's even sequences that act as a domino effect. Bashing one barrel into an enemy knocks them all out. And there's also enemies that require 2 hits to take out, either one with a barrel and then a flame breath, or just 2 barrels. Lining up your shot takes a bit of precision, not a whole lot, but it does add a new layer to the gameplay here in the Cove. Aesthetically, the levels of Gnorc Gnexus are meant to invoke an uneasy feeling in you. You spent the entire game traversing through different environments, but all of them have emphasized nature over urban industrialization. Here though, the rolling hills of Artisans and the snowy mountain caps of magic crafters are replaced with metal and more metal. There's ships, barrels, armored enemies, furnaces, and more, all forged in steel. It's a clear departure from what's come before, which lends credence to the idea that you're in Nasty's world now. The familiarity of the Dragon Worlds has been left behind, but with that, we must forge on. Twilight Harbor is a final test of challenge before facing Nasty Gnorc. The world is pretty straightforward, but the enemies here are tougher than most. Some blast you from a distance, some do so while curving their bullets, and these TNT dudes can be a pain as well. Of course, there was some controversy around these enemies within this remake. In the original game, these enemies shot bullets, and now they just shoot pink goo, probably to appeal more to parents who are considering a purchase of this game for their young children. To be honest, I think it's fine and not really a big deal, but it gets me thinking more about what I mentioned back in Dark Passage, the remake's loss of atmosphere. So many details and changes have been added that does remove some of the original charm felt back in 1998. In a lot of ways, the limitations of the PlayStation 1 forced the team to really hone in on a specific art style. The team used less polygons than they potentially could have just to keep the frame rate higher as you traverse these bigger worlds. The art team did a fantastic job of working within these constraints to create memorable designs, both within the dragons, the enemies, and the worlds. A lot of that was always going to be lost when remaking a game many console generations later. The increase in power meant being able to jam in much more detail than was found previous, and it's something that's going to impress some while leaving others pining for the original aesthetic. I think both of these perspectives are valid, and I think Toys for Bob obviously made the right choice by modernizing the graphics, and even taking the liberty to tweak a few things. However, there's no denying that the atmosphere and mood of this remake is far different than that of the original. Recently, I was watching a video by Joyless called The Ethereal Dream Worlds of Spyro the Dragon. It's an extremely well made video that I recommend checking out. It's over an hour long, but it really does fly by. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. Anyway, the point of that video is an attempt to describe the indescribable. He does his best to detail the feeling evoked in the player by the original game's world and level design. Anyone who played the 1998 game and took the time to soak in the environments will know exactly what is meant about the indescribable feeling that it drums up in your soul. Joyless does a great job of capturing that sensation in his video, and now I'd like to share my own thoughts on that same feeling. The original game had a dreamlike nature to it, one where everything felt familiar and foreign at the same time. Things were familiar, whether man-made or natural, but they were twisted versions of themselves, making them feel eerily alien. Everything was scaled in just a way that often Spyro felt small, especially in these large indoor environments filled with grandiose architecture, like large dome rooftops or glistening tiles. But as we experience these larger-than-life areas, they end up feeling so lonely. The invasive forces of Gnasty Gnorc's army don't feel at home in them, and our dragon allies are sprinkled in just enough that even they don't necessarily feel like the original inhabitants of this world. There's a mystery to it all, one that the game is perfectly okay with letting up to your imagination as you try to decipher what has happened here. The same goes for the natural landscapes that seem to stretch on for miles and miles, owed to the great skybox work that was done back in 1998. Again, the emphasis was on making the levels feel larger than most others in games of the times. A byproduct of that design philosophy was an inherent loneliness to the world, an emptiness, like a dream that takes place without anyone but you, like waking up in the Twilight Zone where only you exist. It's a surreal feeling that persisted throughout the game and culminates in the Dreamweaver's world where everything is a bit nonsensical. It oozed atmosphere and it radiated loneliness and surrealism, and it's a feeling that has been lost in this remake. By cramming in so much more detail, much less is left up to the imagination to fill in the blanks. The questions that the original game provoked in you, like who lives here, why is everything shaped so weirdly, and what's beyond the horizon, are simply not felt in this remake. Your imagination and creative sides as a player are never tapped into, and that has a stranglehold effect on the original's atmosphere and mood. You never quite feel as lonely or as out of place as you do while playing Reignited, and I think that's a large reason for why some players might describe the remake as not feeling quite right or as well realized as it should have been. I want to wrap up this level by once again saying you ought to check out Joyless's video. It's really good and it was a great watch. I really enjoyed it. And what he describes is something that I felt while playing the original back in the day. And feeling the loss of it here in the remake was something I noticed, and his video helped me sort of process it. So yeah, definitely check it out. And with that, we come face to face with the big bad himself, Gnasty Gnorc. He's easily the hardest boss in the game because his world offers no checkpoints, so any death means restarting the entire thing from the beginning. There's 3 phases to the fight. The first sees Gnasty launching laser shots at you in a main room. Charging towards him leads to a lot of damage and makes you realize that you can't get close enough yet. But what you might notice is the giant padlock on the platform that he stands on, and a thief is laughing at you in the distance. By chasing this guy down, you earn a key, but it's not the main one you need. It's actually used to unlock a doorway where you have to chase down another thief for the key that actually unlocks Gnasty's platform. This was sort of a cruel trick, as the side room's padlock is sort of darkened, making it hard to see, and you're probably already thinking you have the key you need, so don't be surprised if you rush him and you die like I did, despite having played this before. The second phase is a chase sequence where you must keep up with the Gnorc and flame him before time runs out. If you aren't fast enough, you'll have to do the chase sequence again. Much like the first part, it's a test of your charging skills. And then finally, the third phase makes you demonstrate your gliding prowess by quickly traversing shrinking platforms. Take too long and a dip in the lava awaits you. But upon keeping up, you reach Nasty Gnorc and flame him one last time to win the fight. It's not really a head-to-head confrontation as much as it is a platforming level, but most of the boss fights have been this way, so it feels like an appropriate final challenge. I will say though that Nasty Gnorc doesn't feel nearly as imposing or threatening as his original iteration. I think that's due to the squeakier voice and more detailed look. The original low polygon model had a sharpness to it that suggested this man was not to be trifled with. It went along with a deeper voice that had some intimidation to it, and that's all been lost here. Many enemies in the game suffer from this problem, but I'd say it affects the bosses the most. Speaking of bosses, and overall, they are weak. They chose to emphasize platforming more than combat in most of the encounters, and while it aligns with the overall playstyle, a bit more challenge in the fights would have went a long way. But with that, we reach the end. We see Spyro return back to what looks like Stone Hill to finish up the interview from the beginning of the game. He basically just says that Nasty Gnorc is toast before doing a bit of gloating, and then the credits roll. From there, we're plopped back into the world where the player is told to find the remaining treasure and dragons to unlock Nasty's final level, a treasure depot where the remaining gems are being stored. I've been 100%ing each level as we go, so we're free to dive into that now. Nasty's loot is that bonus level, and it's sort of like a flight level. I love that it begins with you standing on a platform that seems stranded. Everything else is too far away for a normal glide, but without anything else to do, you give it a try only to discover that you can fly here. It's limited though, as invisible walls keep you relatively low to the ground. The idea here is that by catching up with key thieves, you can unlock doors that raises how high in the air you can fly. It's probably not the best implementation of flight because it just feels strange that Spyro can't go up. There's no physical wall stopping him or any sort of magical explanation, so it comes off as very arbitrary and forced. Still, it's a fun level mostly because of the high rarity of the gems you find here. Every other level was capped at like 500, but here, there's 2,000 points of gems to find. It's like the game said, enough of those low-value red, green, and blue gems. Here, we only deal with yellow and purple. I think showering the player in so many purple gems is particularly rewarding, considering how rare it was to find these in other levels. In other words, by doing everything in the game, you get a chance to bask in all the glory, making you feel sort of rich for a few fleeting seconds. This is especially true in Nasty's room, where there's like 30 or so of the purple shinies to grab up. It's not the most exhilarating bonus world across the series, but for a first attempt, Nasty's loot is fun and does incorporate some of the main mechanics and ideas once more. After this, we get another cutscene showing the true ending. Spyro is once again being interviewed about his fight with Nasty Gnorc until the grand reveal that the king is back, once again trapping dragons and crystals. It's a way of the developers saying, hey, don't be afraid to play the game again someday. And I like the confidence in that. Alright, and that's everything in Spyro the Dragon. Haha, gotcha! Didn't I? I gotcha. Yeah, I know what you're thinking. What about the skill points? He never talked about the skill points. Yeah, I see you. I see you in the comments section roasting me for that, but we're gonna cover them now. You know, perhaps it's some sort of Mandela effect, but I always remembered the 1998 Spyro as having skill points, but no, it was a series feature introduced in Ripto's Rage and were retroactively added to the first game here in the Reignited trilogy. There's 14 skill points to collect here, and most of them are either about destroying a hidden object, like this pink tulip in Artisans, or this stump in Lofty Castle. Or it's about completing a boss fight without taking any damage, like Dr. Shemp or Nasty Gnorc. Finally, there's a few random ones, like charging all the bulls in town square so that they get stuck on their horns. These are little tasks that I can't imagine many people would have found without the guidebook, giving you a point of reference. I guess if 120% completion isn't enough for you, then you can spend another 30 minutes going after these. Completing them all unlocks an art gallery in the guidebook showing off some of the illustrations and concepts that Toys for Bob used while deciding how characters in this remake would look. If you're into this sort of thing, it might be interesting, but for me, since it was the remake concept art instead of the original, it didn't really do much for me. I'm not saying that Toys for Bob should have had the original concept art, how could they, but this newer stuff, yeah, I don't know, it's just not of great value, to an original player like me. Spyro the Dragon remains a special game, whether you're playing the 1998 original or the Reignited trilogies from 20 years later. Regardless of the version, it's clear that the Insomniac team had a great vision for what they wanted this game to be. In a lot of ways, they were pioneering new technology, testing it on the fly, and doing the best they could with what they had. Any sort of limitations can derail a project, but when a team prides themselves on working within them to squeeze out everything possible, it often results in a diamond being forged in the rough. And that's the case with the original Spyro the Dragon. From the very beginning of the game, it's clear that the team's focus was on making large open levels for the time, full of optional paths for the player to explore. The worlds were meant to feel huge and endless, but the gameplay was meant to keep you hooked from second to second, whether it was grabbing a gem off to the side, chasing down an egg thief, finding a new way to reach a faraway dragon, or just doing a bit of good old-fashioned Spyro platforming by pulling off some sick glides. The team gave the player a small toolbox of moves and set them free in these worlds to uncover their secrets, and it's a gameplay approach that has remained enjoyable to revisit even 26 years later. By keeping things simple and allowing for player learning to occur naturally, the game has not fallen off a bit. It's easy to see how much of this has endured thanks to the meticulous work done by Toys for Bob in extracting as much data as they could from the original and using it as a framework to build this remake. I haven't looked at the Ripto's Rage and Year of the Dragon remakes for a few years now, so I can't say for sure that it applies to the whole trilogy, but at the very least, a lot went into making this first game nearly one-to-one. And I think the team deserves a lot of praise for that. Recently, there has been rumors that Toys for Bob is working on a fourth Spyro game, and it would be in the same vein as the original 3. And you know what? I think they've earned the right to do so. So here's hoping it comes out excellent if it's real. Still, it's hard to beat the OG. It's clear something has been lost in this remake. Despite the team's best efforts to modernize the original game, the different approach to art direction leaves the original game's mood and atmosphere in disarray. That sense of mystery, loneliness, isolation, surrealism, and awe has been partially vanquished with the advent of better lighting, updated models, and more detailed textures. To be fair, it was always going to happen when remaking a game from 1998. Today's polish was always going to remove away the nostalgic feeling we get from playing the original game. Still, we have a damn good recreation of Spyro the Dragon here, and revisiting it for this video has been a lot of fun. I hope you enjoyed coming along with me on this journey and hearing my thoughts on many of the game's design principles and stylistic choices. What can I say? I love Spyro the Dragon. Between him and Pokemon Red and Blue, these are the earliest games I have memory of playing and enjoying. And when a game connects with you during your formative years, it's a love that will continue to endure throughout your life. I'm just glad that that love has bloomed once more, resulting in another fun playthrough. Thanks for watching. Hey y'all, you might not have seen this coming, but yeah, I hope you like this lengthy look at Spyro the Dragon. So, the Sly Cooper videos on my channel have done so well that I figured revisiting another old series might get similar results. Hopefully some of that audience will connect with this video as well. I mean, hell, I even tried to style the thumbnail of this video to be on par with those of the Sly ones, so if you are coming over from those videos, please let me know in the comments below. If this video does well, I'd certainly be glad to make similar videos on Ripto's Rage and Year of the Dragon, once again using the Reignited trilogy as a lens. Admittedly, there's a lot more to talk about in Spyro 2 and 3 versus 1, so those videos might be even longer, but it's hard to say. And truth be told, even if this video doesn't do well, I still might make those other videos simply out of my own passion for Spyro. Anyway, as for upcoming videos, I still don't know. 2024 has been weird. There's been a lot of above average and praised games so far, but not many of them have really appealed to me, so I don't know what to promise or to get your expectations set for. I mean, Hellblade 2 is coming out, and we'll see if I can muster the interest to play it, but I'm not sure. Stellar Blade didn't call out to me, but Helldivers 2 has piqued my interest, so maybe that? I'm not sure, but what I do know is that I will be covering the Elden Ring DLC this summer, so stay tuned for that. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Consider subscribing for more. Follow me on Twitter at NopNapNarp. Join our Discord, the link is below. And as always, guys, have a nice day. And take care.